In this video, I am going to look at a game I played last Saturday in a county match against Kent. The match was played at the Sussex home venue in Hassocks. I was on board 6. I had the white pieces and was up against Mike Roberts. I started with e4 and black played the Scandinavian defence d5. After e takes d5, black chose to play knight f6. This is the second most popular move in the position after queen takes d5. The point behind knight f6 is that black wants to be able to recapture on d5 with the knight rather than the queen, because a knight on d5 is rather less exposed than a queen. Now, white's most obvious response is d4, but apart from black capturing on d5 with the knight, black also has the possibility of playing the tricky gambit bishop g4, and this was something that I wanted to avoid. So instead of d4, I played knight f3. Now, in response to this, black normally recaptures on d5. For instance, knight takes d5, which is met by d4, when on general grounds white is just better because of his superior central presence, and indeed it's actually rather easy for black to get into serious trouble after this move. Instead of knight takes d5, black can in fact play queen takes d5, which on the surface seems a bit odd because the whole point of playing knight f6 was to be able to play knight takes d5. But the point of this is that after knight c3, queen a5, d4, we have transposed to the main line after 2 queen takes d5, but with white committed to playing knight f3, rather than, for instance, bishop d2 or bishop c4. So in other words, his options have been restricted. Now, having said that, I'm perfectly happy with the knight f3 line, so this isn't a problem for me. Anyway, instead of either of these recaptures, black continued in gambit style with bishop g4. Now, this is not a move that I was particularly prepared for, but I was aware of an interesting idea for white, and this was to play bishop b5 check. Now, the point behind this move is not to necessarily try to hold on to the d pawn, but to make black waste a lot of time in regaining it. Now, if black played bishop d7, then white would play bishop c4, holding on to the d pawn for a while, and black would be in some difficulties here, as his knight on b8 does not at the moment have a decent square to go to. Anyway, instead of bishop d7, my opponent played the rather more sensible knight on b to d7. And I could have played c4 here, trying to hold on to the pawn, but I continued with my strategy and played knight c3, and after a6 played bishop e2. Black played knight b6, looking to take the pawn on d5, and I played d4. Now black had to decide which knight to capture on d5 with. If he played knight on b takes d5, unlike in the game, I would have been forced to capture the knight with knight takes d5. But after queen takes d5, c4, or knight takes d5, c4, I would have stood very well because of my central control. So rather than play knight on b takes d5, black played knight on f takes d5. Now, here I didn't like the look of playing knight takes d5 because black could play queen takes d5, and this looked less clear because of black's influence over c4. Although white, as far as I can see, is still doing well. But rather than play knight takes d5, I came up with the interesting idea of playing knight e4, avoiding the exchange of knights, but intending to go after the black bishop on g4 instead. And this actually worked out very well. Play went e6, castles, bishop e7, h3, bishop h5, knight g3, bishop g6, knight e5. And as you can see, white is going to be able to take the black light square bishop with one of his knights, gaining the advantage of the bishop pair. And so he would most certainly be better. For instance, after castles, white still doesn't have to grab the bishop, but can just continue with c4, forcing the black knight back, and white has a clear advantage here. Now, my opponent didn't really fancy this, so instead of castles, he played a move which looks tempting, bishop g5. He's hoping to swap a few pieces to ease his position, which is a sensible strategy when you have less space. However, there is a serious problem with this move. However, white missed a chance to get a clearly winning advantage here. He failed to realise how good his position would be after c4, when black moves his knight to b4 or f4, and white responds with bishop f3. So, for instance, after knight b4, bishop f3, white is hitting the black pawn on b7. And if black plays c6, he continues with bishop takes g5, queen takes g5, a3, and the knight on b4 has nowhere to go and is therefore lost. Instead of knight b4, black could play knight f4, which is less immediately catastrophic, but white again can play bishop f3. And if black plays c6, as before, what else? White can start to harass the black minor pieces with h4. The bishop has to drop back to h6 to keep the knight on f4 defended, and then h5. And black is really starting to struggle here. For instance, consider the following forced sequence. Bishop f5, knight takes c6. This is a very interesting way to open things up. B takes c6, bishop takes c6 check, knight d7, bishop takes a8, queen takes a8, bishop takes f4, bishop takes f4, knight takes f5, e takes f5, rook e1 check. And black is in serious trouble here. White has a rook and two pawns for two minor pieces. Those two pawns are the very strong c and d pawns, which are unopposed pass pawns that are clearly going to cause black a great deal of trouble. Also, black will have to move his king, and it will therefore become stuck in the centre and vulnerable to attack. So I think this is pretty obviously hopeless for black. Now, instead of knight f4 or knight b4, black could have played bishop takes c1, but I correctly assessed that after c takes d5, black was in serious difficulties. It was really, I wasn't so sure about the knight moves, in particular knight f4, although, as I've demonstrated, there was no reason for that. Anyway, let's have a look at a couple of possible lines after c takes d5. After bishop takes b2, knight takes g6, black could try bishop takes a1, but after knight takes h8, bishop c3, d takes e6, f takes e6, bishop h5 check, g6, queen f3. White is threatening mate on f7, but is also threatening the bishop on c3. Now, black may be able to pick up the white bishop on h5, but because of how badly exposed his king is, this isn't really going to help him. So this looks clearly winning for white. Instead of bishop takes a1, h takes g6 is more natural, but then rook b1, bishop c3, d takes e6, f takes e6, queen b3 is also winning for white because of the double attack on e6 and c3. So c4 would have given white a winning position here. But, as I said, because he wasn't terribly sure about what was going on after knight f4, he decided, after some thought, to play f4, which is not a terrible move, but not nearly as strong as c4. Black played bishop h4, threatening the knight on g3, and white again failed to play the strongest move. He did consider f5, noting that after bishop takes g3, f takes g6, white's attack on f7 is fatal for black, and also that after bishop takes f5, knight takes f5, e takes f5, rook takes f5, castles, bishop d3, white has a very strong attacking position. For instance, black cannot get away with knight b4 because of queen g4, threatening bishop h6, followed by queen takes g7 mate. And if knight takes d3, then bishop h6, g6, c takes d3. And white has a very strong attack for no material investment. King h8 fails to bishop takes f8 because g takes f5 is not possible on account of either queen g7 mate or knight takes f7 mate. So it was clear to white that his position was very strong after bishop takes g3 or bishop takes f5, but the move he was concerned about was e takes f5. However, after knight takes f5, white is still doing very well here. For instance, to give a sample line of play, bishop f6, bringing the bishop back to defend g7, knight g4. White prefers to go after the dark square bishop rather than the light square bishop because it's a more important defender. h5, knight takes f6 check, queen takes f6, bishop d3. Now white is threatening rook e1 check, so black has to castle. Castles kingside, just fails to knight h6 check with a discovered attack on the queen, while castles long is better, but after the simple c3, white is on top. He has the bishop pair. Black's king is obviously more vulnerable than white's, and there's also the immediate threat of knight h6. So this is really not very attractive for black at all. However, as I said, white wasn't that sure about the position after e takes f5, and this led him to choose the rather more cautious knight takes g6. But after h takes g6, black's position is now very solid. Play went knight e4, bishop e7, c4, knight f6, and now white could see nothing better than exchanging on f6, knight takes f6 check. He would have preferred to have avoided exchanges because as the side with more space, this is generally the best thing to do, but he couldn't see a constructive way to do so. After bishop takes f6, white defended d4 with bishop e3, and play went queen d7, queen d2, castles. Black offered a draw. White declined because he thought he had an advantage here, but the position is actually reasonably balanced. Having said that, there's no reason that white shouldn't continue here, because although technically speaking his position may not be better at the moment, there's certainly some potential there for outplaying his opponent. So play went rook on a to d1, rook on a to d8, b3. White is gradually trying to improve his position. By playing b3, he emphasises the poor position of the black knight on b6, and black sensibly took measures to redeploy that knight to a better square with knight c8. Black is now intending to play knight e7, and part of the motivation behind white's response, g4, was to prevent knight e7 because now g5 wins a piece. Now, this wasn't the only idea behind g4. It is a decent move on general grounds because white gains space and continues to cramp black. Now, black probably should have played bishop h4 to enable knight e7 because g5 would no longer win a piece. And if white tried playing g5 with the intention of trapping the bishop on h4, black could very well play knight e7 followed by knight f5, occupying the weakened f5 square with a good game. However, rather than bishop h4, black played the rather passive rook on f to e8, which just looks like a waste of time. Now, white started to play without much of a plan and play quite a few indifferent moves from this point onwards. The immediate bishop f3 hitting the pawn on b7 looks like the most natural way to improve white's position, but instead he played queen c2, which doesn't have a lot of point to it, and black decided to play c6, anticipating white's next bishop f3, which is the move he should have played on the previous turn. Now, white may be threatening d5, so black preempted this with queen c7, and play went bishop g2, queen a5, queen f2, rook d7. Now, as I said, white's play has been a little planless over the last few moves, but he hasn't done anything to fundamentally ruin his position. And now something like rook d3 looks very sensible, enabling white to triple on the d-file with a perfectly decent position. However, there doesn't seem to be any particular way he's going to break down black's defences. However, that was a lot better than playing g5, which is needlessly commiserate, as white lacks a real follow-up. After bishop e7, white's position was still acceptable if he had played something like h4, because after knight d6 he could play rook d3, and after knight f5, rook on f to d1. And although black is obviously perfectly fine now because of his strong knight on f5, white isn't in serious trouble either. However, rather than play something sensible like h4, white played bishop e4, but he'd overlooked black's response, knight d6, gaining a tempo, allowing him to build up pressure on d4 more quickly. Play went bishop b1, knight f5. Black increases the pressure on d4. Bishop d2. Now, this move was intended to tempt black to play bishop b4, which is indeed what he played, but queen d8 was better, increasing the pressure on d4 and not needlessly exchanging pieces. The point is, after bishop b4, bishop takes b4, queen takes b4, the black queen is no longer covering the knight on f5. And if white had played bishop takes f5 as he originally intended, although black's position would be preferable, white's position is not too bad and should be reasonably easy to defend. However, white chose to play rook on f to e1, which is an attempt to be clever, but it allows black a free move to attack d4 with more pieces. Now, the idea behind rook on f to e1 is to be able to play bishop f5 when, because of the pin on the e-file, black is unable to recapture with the e-pawn and has to play g takes f5 when white will be able to mix things up with g6. However, the flaw is that black can just play rook on e to d8, and he has even more pressure on d4 than he would otherwise have. Indeed, white cannot really avoid losing a pawn now. He played bishop takes f5. Now, e takes f5 would be a mistake because the tactic that works in the game will not now work, because after rook d3, rook takes d4, rook takes d4, rook takes d4 can be met by rook e8 check because the e-file is open. Black was hoping for queen takes d4, queen takes e1 check, which is naturally very much in his favour. But after rook e8 check, king h7, queen takes d4, white is just a rook up and therefore clearly winning. However, black, rather than playing e takes f5, played g takes f5. Now, black is still winning in this position, but white does have an opportunity to mix things up with g6. Now, black correctly pushed on with his intended combination, rook takes d4, and after g takes f7 check, king takes f7, rook takes d4, rook takes d4, white cannot play queen takes d4 because of queen takes e1 check. So instead of queen takes d4, white went for queen e2, which creates threats of both queen takes e6 check with mate and queen h5 check with a likely perpetual. Queen d6. Black used up most of his remaining time on this move. This left him playing on not much more than the 10-second increment. Not surprisingly, he bailed out with a draw, although there was a difficult to find, under the circumstances, win. Queen h5 check. Now, black played king f8, but what he should have played was g6. The point is that after queen h7 check, king f6, queen h8 check, king e7, queen g7 check, king d8, the black king escapes the checks, leaving white facing insoluble problems, in particular the pawn on f4. However, as I said, because of black's extreme time shortage, he opted to play the safe king f8. Play then went queen h8 check, king f7, queen h5 check, and again black could have played g6, which would have been winning if black followed it up correctly, but instead he decided to allow the repetition with king f8, and after queen h8 check, king f7, white successfully claimed a draw by threefold repetition with queen h5 check. So this was a bit of a lucky escape for white in the end, but on the other hand, black was lucky that white failed to play either 13 c4 or 14 f5, which would have left black in big trouble.